Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Liz Seaton, and I am a curator at the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art at Kansas State University. Welcome to Let's Talk Art, one of a series of discussions with artists, art historians, and other creative thinkers about works in our museum's collection. Today, we have with us art historian Laura Fry of the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She's here to talk about two paintings by artist brothers Edward Moran and Thomas Moran that are on view at our museum. It's a special situation because the Thomas Moran painting is on loan from Crystal Bridges Museum of Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. It's a rare opportunity for our museum to see landscape imagery by the two brothers side by side in person for study and enjoyment. This program, just a little housekeeping, this program will last 30 minutes. It's being recorded and will be accessible on the museum's YouTube channel. If you'd like to pose a question or comment for the Q&A, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Closed captioning is available for those who need it, and you can just hit the CC button on the bottom of your screen to access that. Since we are talking about perspectives on the American landscape today, it seems especially important to begin with an acknowledgement that K-State, as the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, is historically home to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Many Native nations use the Western Plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal and efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation for this institution is, and still is, stolen land. So let me introduce our speaker for this evening, my partner in the conversation. Laura Fry began as senior curator and curator of American art at Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2015. Fry earned her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Washington University in St. Louis. She received a master's degree in art history from the University of Denver. Before coming to the Gilcrease, she worked at the Tacoma Art Museum in Washington State and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. So it's good to have you here with us, Laura. Looking forward to talking to you. Apologize for my nasally voice. Spring has sprung in Kansas.
Here too.
I guess we're ready for our slides.
Okay. Here we go.
And I thought I would just identify the works.
There we go.
Before we get started with your commentary. So these are the works by the two brothers in the Beach Museum of Art Galleries. The Thomas Moran will be on loan just through, well, it is on loan for a bit, but we will be having to take it down in about 2 weeks. So I hope you'll have a chance to come to the museum and take advantage of this pairing. So what you see on the right is Thomas Moran's work called Valley of the Catawissa in Autumn from 1862, and it's an oil on canvas, again, on loan from Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. On the left is our work by Edward Moran, his older brother, and it's been given the title of Western Landscape, dated 1866 on the back of the painting, and it's an oil on canvas. It was a gift of Charles V. Kincaid in 1963. And when it came into the collection, it was kind of a big deal. It made the newspapers, it made the Wichita Beacon, it made the Manhattan Mercury. The person who donated it, Charles Kincaid, was identified at the time as a retired member of the Kansas Board of Regents, which was sort of in charge of the 6 state universities, and a native of Independence, Kansas. Otherwise, we don't have a lot of story about the provenance of the painting, and we'll get into a little bit more of that later. The painting was on view on campus, and then when our building was built, it came into our collection. Unfortunately, it sat quietly in storage for many decades, 2 decades, I should say, because it was quite damaged. Laura's going to show a slide some of the problems with the work. That's the work on the left. So you can see the painting during treatment, and you can see some examples of some of the problem areas where there's loss of paint or cracking of paint. The canvas was got all out of whack, not stretched taut the way it needs to be. Varnish was discolored in different areas, and you can see on the left that the conservators in Denver have started to remove yellowing varnish. And it's kind of interesting, kind of neat on the right, what it looks like. And then we can go back to the painting itself.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful. I hope you'll be able to come see it. We're going to look at it tonight in slides, but it is just stunning, as is the Thomas Moran. So having the Crystal Bridges loan is, again, as I said, a really special thing. Thomas Moran was a major figure in American art, and Laura can talk about that more. You'll learn about that. It's nice to get the brothers together so it can help us, our museum, learn more about our Edward Moran painting from the point of view of his family biography, geography, and history, to, explore the brothers' relationship and think about how they were representing the American landscape at this time, which was around the Civil War. So Laura, I think we brought her into this conversation because she is a curator at a museum that has a huge Thomas Moran collection. So she's going to tell us a little bit about that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, Liz, for the invitation. It's been a really interesting journey to look into the Edward Moran painting with you over the last couple months. And I'm pleased to speak today. But yeah, like Liz said, I work at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we have, if you haven't had a chance to visit, Gilcrease has an interdisciplinary collection that's really a broad scope of the art, history, and culture of the Americas. We have a painting and sculpture collection of American art that stretches back about 350 years. We have an archive and library collection with wide variety of manuscripts and rare books from 1594 through the early 20th century, and also a really extensive collection of indigenous anthropology in the Gilcrease collection. And our origin story is honestly unlike any museum I've encountered. In some ways, we were founded by Thomas Gilcrease, who was an had accumulated his oil wealth in Oklahoma during the oil boom in the early 20th century. But Thomas Gilcrease is also a citizen of the Muskogee Nation. And his oil wealth came about because the allotment that he was awarded when the reservations were split in Oklahoma happened to be at the site of the first major petroleum discovery in the state. So it was a really interesting kind of happenstance. But he built this collection, built a lot of relationships with contemporary Native artists in Oklahoma, and also pursued works by historical American artists like Thomas Moran. So more about that in just a moment. But at the moment, you can't come and visit us because we are actually closed to the public. If you look behind me, you can see a construction site out the windows. We're in the middle of building an entirely new museum. We have the original museum building was Mr. Gilcrease's carriage house. It had a whole host of issues. It was a very confusing layout, and we anticipate opening somewhere in mid-2026. So we certainly encourage you to come back and visit. In the meantime, we are definitely not looking for things to do. The curatorial team's in the middle of designing new gallery spaces throughout, and really completely overhauling the interpretation of the museum. And it's also a chance to really dive into research into the Gilcrease collection. So one of the projects that we just completed about a year ago was an entirely new research and collections access site for the Thomas and Mary Nemo Moran collection at Gilcrease. In 2019, we received a 3-year grant from the Henry Luce Foundation for almost $900,000. And this was to research, conserve, rehouse, and digitize 2 major collections at Gilcrease, including the Moran collection. This is the largest collection of both Thomas Moran and his wife, Mary Nemo Moran's work in the world. Thomas Gilcrease purchased the bulk of this material directly from Thomas Moran's estate in 1948 after Thomas Moran's daughter passed away. This collection is more than 2,000 items. It includes a lot of hundreds of works on paper by both Thomas and Mary. Mary was an etcher and a printmaker, so we even have some of her etching plates, one of which you can see here. It includes hundreds of Thomas Moran's field sketches from all of his travels across the United States. That's all right. And it also includes many of his oil paintings. But then there's an archive collection with this too. So we've got artwork inventories, letters, catalogs from exhibitions that they were involved with in the 19th century. And most of this material was largely inaccessible to the public. It was a lot of delicate works on paper. These were not items that we could place on view for long periods of time. A lot of these items hadn't been recently photographed. So now 100% of this material is available through the Gilcrease online collections to the public. So the high resolution images, so if you go to gilcrease.org and hit our online collections, you can see the entire Moran collection.
It's impressive.
Yeah, I keep discovering new things, even, through this whole process. It's been, it's such a large collection. It's been really incredible. But so I wanted to say just, a little bit of an introduction to Thomas, and then I'll also bring Edward into the conversation as well. So Thomas Moran was born in England. His whole family moved from England to the United States when he was about 7 years old. So his brother Edward was born in England as well, and they were not terribly wealthy. They were essentially, if you've ever read like a Charles Dickens novel describing the depths of urban poverty during the Industrial Revolution, the town they lived in Bolton, England sounds like it could have been the setting for one of those. It was an industrial town. His parents worked in the textile industry, and the kind of factory conditions and even sanitation at that point were not keeping up with the pace of growth and urban growth. So I think in many ways, were really escaping some of the downsides in the Industrial Revolution. They moved to Philadelphia and also work in the textile industry in Pennsylvania. But Thomas, really inspired by his brother Edward, who was the oldest of the brothers, Edward developed an interest in art and ended up introducing much of the rest of the family to this field. And they initially they were almost entirely self-taught. They did very little formal schooling for their artwork, but they observed the work of other artists, spent a lot of time observing nature and getting out into the landscape in Philadelphia. And we probably wouldn't know as much about them today, but Thomas, of all the brothers, was the one who really was able to hit a real jackpot of success with his art career. And he's best known today for his connection to Yellowstone National Park. In 1871, he was invited to join the first government expedition to the Yellowstone region. And at this point, most of the descriptions of Yellowstone were basically regarded as giant fabrications. The people thought mountain men had just been out in the wilderness a little bit too long. There couldn't possibly be, boiling hot springs with rainbow colors and geysers shooting hundreds of feet in the air. It's like people thought this was just really just exaggerated and invented. So with this government, the Hayden expedition, 1871, brought a photographer, William Henry Jackson, and Thomas Moran, a painter. The two of them worked really closely together. And Thomas produced all these of course, you don't have color photography in 1871. So Thomas Moran's watercolors from this trip really captured the brilliant tones that you get in the Yellowstone hot springs and the rock formations. And so the two of them really worked together to even compose images, and he helped the photographer frame some of his shots. And in fact, this image in the very middle, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that is, this is an image from Green River, Wyoming. Today, if you take I-80 across the country, you go right past it. But this was Thomas Moran's very first sketch made in the American West when he got off the train in Green River on that trip. So they returned to the East, and the trip's leader, Ferdinand Hayden, proposes to U.S. Congress to protect this area from developers and from being really carved up into private developments, and really proposes his idea of a park. And as Congress is debating the bill to create what would become Yellowstone National Park, they hung Thomas Moran's watercolors and Jackson's photographs all around the Capitol building. And they were really instrumental in convincing Congress to create our nation's first national park. So I think it's a great example of how art really can have a major impact on the world we see around us. Congress then commissions Thomas Moran to create a major painting of Yellowstone to celebrate this milestone. So he, a year later, does this painting of the lower falls of the Yellowstone Canyon in 1872, and this is 12 feet wide. Congress purchased it for $10,000, which was an extraordinary sum in the late 19th century, and Thomas Moran is suddenly a celebrity. So it really makes his career. And as I said, so many of these family members were artists. Thomas Moran was a painter best known for his images of the American West, but his wife, Mary Nemo Moran, was an etcher, and she was one of the first women to join several national etching societies in the United States and really had an extraordinary career in her own right. Edward Moran, whose work is also on view at the Beach Museum of Art, was a painter and the oldest of the brothers, and really Thomas credited him with getting all of them started in art. John Moran was a photographer. Peter Moran was another painter and an art instructor, and even really championed the careers of several women artists. I think Peter's wife was also an artist. So they, some of their nieces and nephews were also artists. It really sounds like just an incredible creative, almost like it sounds like an incredible creative environment. And many of these family members or extended family members lived in the same household at various points or in very kind of a tight-knit community. So I can only imagine that they're sharing ideas back and forth and finding venues to exhibit their work and really having a lot of influence on one another. I would have loved to have hung out in their home and just like seen them interact at some point.
Yeah.
Like I said, Edward was the oldest of the brothers. And he, unlike Thomas and I think Peter and also John, we don't have any records of Edward traveling to the American West. He might have, but it didn't really make it into the historic record. Thomas stated that he said that he taught the rest of us Morans all we know about art and grounded us in the principles we have worked on all our lives. It is scarcely probable that any of us would have been painters if it had not been for Edward's encouragement and assistance. And beyond just his initial interest in art and his encouragement of his younger brothers, he also was working in the power loom business in the mills in Philadelphia as a young man, even just helping financially support the family so that his brothers were able to and doing sketching and painting in his free time. So he really supported the family on multiple levels.
I understand he didn't like doing that though.
No, I don't think any of them did. I think there's a reason they all got into art at different points. Yeah. And so Edward got into, he was doing some painting, but he also was supplementing his income as a lithographer and doing illustrations for various publications. Thomas started working for him as a lithographer and a printmaker as well. And really, if you look at all of their careers, they're all kind of testing out lots of different things, much like professional artists today might do, teaching, might be working on a commission, might be showing at a gallery or doing a whole variety of things to really create an art career. I think this family was doing the same thing then too. A major event for Thomas and Edward was in 1862. They both traveled to England. And they were really captivated by the work of British painter J.M.W. Turner. And they spent a couple of months sketching outdoors, visiting places where Turner had worked. And one of the things they really learned there was that Turner's paintings of a particular landscape didn't always match what you saw when you went there in person. They really noticed that Turner rearranged his compositions, that he might have included information in one of his landscape paintings from kind of multiple perspectives. And so he wasn't keeping this meticulous fidelity to nature, but was really creating a mood, creating a feeling related to the landscape. And you'll definitely notice that in both Edward's and Thomas's work. So back to these two paintings at there in Kansas. These are
Well, I was
both,
gonna say, we started our conversation
yeah,
because I needed to make a label for the Edward
yeah.
Moran. And I was wondering, is Western Landscape the correct title for this? It's not on the work. We don't have, didn't come in with paperwork in the 60s to indicate. It indicated that it was, the title was Western Landscape, but it just didn't seem right. And I wanted to confirm that with you. And so you helped me determine that probably not the
Yeah.
West as we understand it.
Yeah, and this was a really frequent, this is a not infrequent occurrence for you know, when we're working in museums and working with art collections, as we were doing this last couple of years of research with the Luce grant on the Moran collection, we changed several titles after new information became available. Oftentimes the title for an artwork is not what the artist originally called it. It might be what a later collector or an art dealer decided to title something. If sometimes an artist doesn't title their work, sometimes that documentation gets lost. For any artists out there, write it on the piece, like date 2. We historians love to see that. But it's but very frequently, we don't know what an artist intended to title a work. And I'm guessing with this one that someone took a look at this snow-capped mountain and knew that Thomas Moran was so famous for painting the West, and assumed that his brother therefore must have also been painting the Western United States. But it gets a little curious because we don't believe Edward ever traveled to like west of the Mississippi into the Rocky Mountain region or the Western region. And when you look at these together, like, they sure look similar, don't they? I mean, even they almost look like one continual panorama in a way. But even the vegetation, the rocks, the fall colors. And so we really, we started really looking into, what could have inspired this landscape, but that's currently titled Western Landscape. And it looks like we do know that Thomas Moran and all 3 of his brothers went on a sketching trip to Catawissa in central Pennsylvania, a more hilly mountainous region of Pennsylvania in 1861. And that is what inspired the painting at the Crystal Bridges collection. And that got us thinking, like, I wonder if that trip also inspired maybe it's even a composite landscape, but the Western landscape painting.
Which is 4 years.
Yeah,
4
4 years later.
later.
So it's not terribly later. It's a little bit later than the work by Thomas Moran, but seems to have a whole lot of resonance. And the Thomas Moran painting is pretty interesting here because it's really, I think it's interesting that it's showing that it seems like it was commissioned, at least according to some of the research from Crystal Bridges, that at least he translated some of his sketches from this trip in 1861 into a travelogue for the Catawissa Railroad route. So it was really used by the railroad to promote this picturesque imagery, to promote, visitors to come up and see the fall colors. But then a couple years later, when he exhibits this painting, he's completely removed the railroad from the view. There is, I think, no sign of human habitation in either of these paintings. They're really just looking at the natural world absent human presence.
And you were mentioning that the Catawissa are probably a little lower in elevation than these paintings suggest.
Yeah.
Well, the Thomas anyway, if it could be speculation that the Edward Moran is the Catawissa.
Yeah.
It can't be.
Well, and I was looking at some of the sketches that we have by Thomas in the Gilcrease collection, here's a few, I guess, details from the Thomas Moran painting, where again, you can really see that there's no town there, there's no railroad. There's some animals kind of sprinkled in through the landscape. But it's and the detail is really fantastic, especially on Thomas Moran, really great at painting rocks. But here's one of Thomas's sketches from the Gilcrease collection that I thought just again had some that shows Philadelphia, or shows the Pennsylvania landscape again, that to me sure looks like it has some echoes of the Edward Moran composition. Another one of Thomas Moran's sketches of Pennsylvania. And here's a lithograph, I believe, by Thomas Moran, again showing a scene from Pennsylvania. And Edward wasn't the only one to exaggerate. Here's a photograph of Catawissa, a contemporary photograph, and you can see, Thomas Moran was maybe taking those hills and
Yes.
stretching them a little bit. So I think both of these brothers were certainly very inspired by these landscapes, but doing their own, taking their own artistic license to these scenes and really amping up some of the drama of these landscape scenes. He got the color spot on though, which I think is really interesting here. But yeah, and back to just these two again, and I really it's a really love. I'm so glad you were able to borrow the Thomas Moran work, especially after getting the Edward Moran painting conserved, because it's really shows I think the interplay between these two artists and some of the some of the inspiration they might have been sharing back and forth.
Yeah, and initially I didn't note the erasure of any human presence there. It's difficult to see, but in the middle, the center right, there are 3 deer. So they are the only inhabitants of Edward's painting. They both have waterways. Yeah, and those rock formations are just beautiful.
Yeah, and in some ways, Thomas would often do this, and even some of the other Hudson River School painters will include a group of animals almost as though they are like standing in for human observers. So I think it's interesting, the little deer family here, they're kind of out of scale too. Like those are really big deer. But they're almost like a family having a picnic on the bank of the river, but he's used deer instead of humans. And it's interesting. I mean, I think there were a lot of reasons for that omission. So for the focus on the landscape imagery, devoid of human presence. If you think about the context for these two paintings, they're painting in central Pennsylvania in the 1860s. For Thomas, it's in the middle of the Civil War. For the Edward Moran's painting, it's just after the Civil War. And I mean, so these scenes were not terribly far away from Gettysburg. And in some ways, I'd imagine at this point in American history, they didn't really want to think about what humans were doing on the lands. And in many ways, I think these landscapes were escapism. They were a way to find solace in nature, especially as the country was going through and emerging from such a monumental, tragic event in so many ways, and so an event that really would have impacted everybody. I think it's part of the reason that, this is before, in the 1860s, none of these brothers had yet traveled west of the Mississippi River. I don't think they'd traveled west of Pennsylvania at this point. But it's a part of the reason that I think that the interest in the Western landscape increased so dramatically in the late 19th century. It was as Americans were really looking to a part of the continent that had not been impacted by the Civil War.
Yeah, that historical context is very interesting. And you noted that in our conversation. I hadn't thought about it when I was putting together my label. So this is a wonderful, much more in-depth exploration of the painting that we've been able to express where it's publicly on view. And now I'd like to welcome any questions people may have about this conversation and the works. You can put those in the Q&A. Do you happen to know if the brothers had to serve in the Civil War, or any of the Moran family members?
Good question. I don't believe any of them served in the Civil War. And that's interesting because they were actually all about that age. They were all about or at least Thomas would have been in his 20s, 30s. So no, I don't believe any of them served. Yeah. That'd be an interesting thing to look into, because they all would have been around that age. And there were a lot of immigrants who served in the Civil War.
I have one question from Catherine Slogic. Would you talk about the relationship with these paintings to the idea of manifest destiny?
Certainly, they're very, very closely connected. So as you may know, this idea of manifest destiny was an idea that really emerged um, more kind of completely in the mid 19th century, just before the Civil War, and gained a lot of steam, literal and figurative, in the decades right after the Civil War. But this was a concept that Americans were destined by God to extend the United States across the whole continent from coast to coast. And this was, it was basically this assumption of a divine mandate to send new settlers into the American West. And it was also part of the ideology also really emphasized this concept of inevitable vanishing and changing of native cultures. So there was, and this is not new in the 19th century, this idea that indigenous cultures would inevitably change or vanish from North America was something that was really overwhelmingly heavily promoted, especially in the 19th century. And I think it was partly it was partly a way for European American settlers to excuse some of this theft of land. If you were taking land from someone who is already vanishing, then perhaps you're not really stealing it. And certainly there were the landscape painters that are working across the United States, from, you know, the Hudson River School up in New England all the way out through California. Many of their images are absolutely connected to this idea in various ways. I think many of these artists were certainly cognizant of indigenous presence, especially as you go out west and they're actually encountering like various indigenous nations that had not yet been removed or forcibly relocated. But it's these images, while they're, I think, in the process of showing this pristine, empty landscape, are also very much kind of creating this myth of wilderness that's, again, tied to this idea of manifest destiny, that this idea that the Americas were simply a blank canvas when Europeans arrived, and a place where where there was resources, this idea of endless resources and endless abundance, which I think we're still struggling with today. It's part of, with this idea of accepting that natural resources are in fact very finite. So this idea, it's celebrating American lands, especially for these brothers who are immigrants, but there's very much a sense of kind of claiming these lands or seizing this opportunity or seeing this land as something that's really this bountiful area that's available for the taking, which is very much tied to the concept of manifest destiny. That's a long explanation, but we're designing like an entire gallery around that in the new building, so I could go on for longer, but it's
Great, thanks.
yeah.
There's a related question from Eileen Wong. Do
Mhm.
the archival materials at the Gilcrease indicate what kinds of people the Moran brothers would have encountered on their trip to the wilderness in Pennsylvania? Any indigenous peoples?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know. A lot of the archival materials we have would have been a little bit later in their careers. I don't think I'd have to check. It's all online now. It's like possible to see. We don't have them all transcribed. So a lot of it's, you know, working through the 19th century script. Because most of the archival materials we have are from a little later in their careers in life, or it's even Thomas Moran's daughter, Ruth, writing about her father. So I don't know if our collection has as much from their earlier career in the 1860s in Pennsylvania. I don't know whether they would have encountered indigenous people in Pennsylvania at that time. I imagine probably not distinct, based on just so many of the indigenous nations that had lived in Pennsylvania by that point had already been pushed to Ohio or Indiana, or even relocated here to Oklahoma. There are several. Oklahoma is now home to 39 federally recognized tribes from all over the country, and some of them were from Ohio, the Ohio River Valley, in that area. So areas that have been fairly close to what is, you know, now Pennsylvania. I don't know if, but I don't know the answer to that. That would be a fascinating inquiry, though. And Thomas does occasionally include indigenous people in his compositions, but it's almost like a prop, like, or oftentimes his human figures are included simply to show kind of the scale of the landscape, or to demonstrate that this is the Americas and not somewhere in the Alps or in Europe. So it's not, I don't think he really includes indigenous, and with a couple of exceptions, most of his portrayals of indigenous people aren't as maybe carefully considered or really intended to show a specific culture. It's more of a generalization.
You know, there is a book about Edward that's from the late 1970s. There's really not as much written about Edward as there is Thomas, but there's a painting that Edward did depicting two Native Americans looking out over the waters and seeing a clipper ship coming in basically to invade their lives. It's a later work. It's called Henry Hudson Entering New York Bay, and it's from 1857. So that's interesting. And of course, they were depicting sometimes laborers. I mean, they concentrated on the landscape or the waters, but American laborers.
Yeah, and that was more Edward. Thomas very rarely depicted figures in his work, and then when you see some of those paintings, you like, he wasn't very good at figures. Like, I mean, he had no formal training. I think Edward's figures are actually much better. I think Edward is a lot better at painting people. So I think part of it was Thomas got really good at painting rocks and wasn't as good as and wasn't as successful with rendering people. So maybe a little bit of a practical concern there too.
Well, I don't see any more questions, and it is about 36 minutes into the program, so I think we'll end it here. But I wanted to thank you again, Laura, for all that you've done to help me get started understanding this work, and for being here tonight. And when will the Gilcrease be open again?
We are hoping, we don't have an exact date, but we're hoping in mid-2026. The building itself the architecture will be finished by the end of this year, but then it's going to take more than a year to move the collections back in. Our total collection is about 350,000 items. So most of it is being stored right now in an offsite bunker that is near the airport. It's sort of an old a converted warehouse that we retrofitted to be appropriate for art storage. So we'll be moving the collection back after the construction and building out all of the exhibitions, and that will take quite a bit. But in the meantime, the whole Moran collection and all of the archives are available to view online. So, and also our research center, which is where I am right now, we have a separate building that is our research center that houses our library and archive. And so if you're interested, you can schedule research visits here. This collection is available to view by appointment. And if we also offer travel scholarships for visiting researchers. So we do some short-term fellowships. If you're interested if you have a research project that could make use of our archive collection, we do have, which is far beyond Thomas Moran. We have a fantastic Spanish colonial collection and some really incredible collections related to indigenous leaders from Indian Territory from the early 19th century. So it's very broad, but if you're interested, we do have some fellowships available here as well, which you could look up again on the Gilcrease website.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, well,
we do. Somebody just mentioned, I saw the comments. We do have a new director. Also, we have our previous director had just retired a few months ago, but we just announced about a week ago. The new director is starting in a couple months, and it's Brian Wisenhunt. He is currently the director of the Rockwell Museum in Corning, New York, and he'll be starting at Gilcrease on April 15th. So we are super excited for Brian. He's originally from Tulsa, so we're really excited for Brian to start here soon. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and just take care. Have a good night.
Thanks.